Welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. This week I will be coloring this Picket Fence Studio stamp. It's called Sweet Sweet Dear, and of course when I saw it I had to have it because I have many girls in my life who love watermelon. I will be coloring this image with Prismacolor pencils today. I'm stamping it with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink onto a piece of Neenah Solar White Classic Crest 80-pound cardstock. I am not worried about a perfect stamping the first time out because after I have colored it, I will need to stamp it again because the pigment from the colored pencils will kind of dull and make the black stamped lines not look that great. So when I have finished coloring, I will stamp it with Versiclare Nocturne Black ink because it stamps wonderfully every time. When I color with Prismacolor pencils, I start with the darkest, the shadows, and go toward the lightest, the highlights. I usually color each section at least 2, if not 3 times. And today I will even bring in a blending pencil to kind of blend some of these colors together, especially the reds for the watermelon because reds are tricky. I think that's all there is about the coloring. Oh, I did end up fussy cutting this out and leaving a small margin and then creating a scene card at the end. I fussy cut it because my Scan and Cut was having a hard time picking up the boundaries of her hair. So, now that we're done talking about the coloring, let's talk about the crime. Our alphabetical journey today takes us to the state of South Carolina. The area of South Carolina was part of the original territory of the United States. Both North and South Carolina were included in the charter that established Carolina in 1663. The two areas separated in 1712, a separation, thank you so much, words are hard, a separation that was finalized when the Carolina colony was dissolved in 1729. Among the 13 original colonies to sign the Declaration of Independence, South Carolina was grounds for more battles during the Revolutionary War than any other state. Over 200 battles of the Revolutionary War were fought here. South Carolina ceded area to the United States to assume generally the same boundary as it currently has. South Carolina ratified the U.S. Constitution on May 23, 1788, and it was the 8th of the original 13 colonies to join the Union. They did cede from the United States before they were the first state to secede before the Civil War broke out. Funny thing about South Carolina is that they produce more peaches than Georgia. And just between you and me, Georgia's actually third. Just don't tell them. Charleston, South Carolina is home to one of the oldest trees in the country, and barbecue was in fact born in South Carolina. People believe that the Native Americans living in South Carolina showed colonists how to cook with this particular technique. One of the most unusual state legends in South Carolina is the story of the Lizard Man. Apparently, there was a young man, a high school boy, whose car broke down near a scape or swamp, and in his police report, he said that when he got out to change a flat tire, he was approached by a, quote, 7-foot-tall green scaly man with 3 fingers and red eyes. Apparently, this creature attacked his car, leaving scratch marks. I don't know. South Carolina has a monkey colony on Morgan Island of more than 3,000 rhesus monkeys. And one of the greatest American writers who popularized both detective fiction and horror fiction, yes, you got it, Edgar Allan Poe, spent nearly a year being stationed in Fort Moultrie, I know I said that wrong, after joining the military. Something that is not widely known about him. Just saying. He's one of my daughter's favorites. And South Carolina is home to the country's first female serial killer. Or not. By the time of the American Revolution, South Carolina was one of the richest colonies in America. Merchants and planters formed a strong governing class, and with the invention of things like the cotton gin, crops became major cash. South Carolina also has a coast, and it became a busy port with ships bringing goods from other parts of the world to sell. So the people who grew things to sell had to get them to the stores to sell them, and those who imported the goods had to get their goods to stores or to the people who had ordered them or who could pay their prices. And this created the need of a new type of business. Enter wagon shipping, the precursor of the modern semi-truck. In order to transport your crops or your goods, you needed to travel down the highway by wagon from farm or port to stores. In addition to wagon shipping, there was the need to rest. These wagons are pulled by horses, and the horses have drivers. And this is also when people were traveling by wagon. And so rest stops were created, but they were called inns. These inns were located outside towns along major travel routes and were typically named by their location to the town. Often, these inns offered more than just a place to rest your horses, feed your horses, rest your drivers, feed your horses. Some of these inns had gambling and other activities, sex workers, for travelers and drivers to engage in during their downtime. So there's another business that was emerging. And there's still another type of business that is emerging, the highwayman. Along with prosperity, there came this other thing, crime, right? Anytime there's prosperity, there's also crime. Driving your wagon into town from farm or port with the hopes of selling your goods was not always simple or safe. Nor was leaving town and heading back home with your pockets full of money or gold. Wagons were hijacked by highwaymen as they approached, and then the drivers were robbed as they left town. And this, while it is not a legitimate business, was a big business in the 1800s South Carolina. Charleston was a major port city, and it brought in plenty of traders, and those traders kept the highwaymen busy. And all of these things merged together to create one heck of a story. Now, our main characters today have very little known background. In fact, until they arrived on the scene in Charleston, they were relatively unknown. It is reported that a woman named Lavinia grew up and married a man named John Fisher. Lavinia's maiden name is not known. Her parents' names are not known. It is thought that they both grew up in Charleston, but there's no family history for either of the Fishers known. They lived near Charleston, and they made their living operating an inn called the 6 Mile Wayfarer House. So this inn was located 6 miles north of Charleston, thus the name 6 Mile Wayfarer House. Their building was well kept and well maintained. It had a place to rest and feed the horses, the riders, the travelers. And John and Lavinia were well liked in town, and they had lots of friends. They were considered good neighbors. And Lavinia was reportedly beautiful and charming. And her beauty and charm was an asset for their business and their popularity in the community. Eventually, though, as the highwaymen became more and more prevalent, stories began to surface about unsuspecting men being lured into a few of the inns to join in poker games, only then to be cheated out of their money by crooked gambling practices and scams. In addition to the complaints made by these men who had just lost all of their money in what they thought were a, quote, gentleman's gamble, meaning no real money, a man named Stephen Lacoste reported that his cow had been stolen right out of his pasture. And it seemed that the highwaymen had moved on from hijacking and gambling into outright thievery of the locals. Then, mysteriously, men who were visiting Charleston began to disappear. And as more and more reports were filed with the authorities regarding these missing men, it was determined that they were all last seen at the 6 Mile Wayfarer house, John and Lavinia's inn. It seemed sometimes guests checked in and did not check out of the 6 Mile Inn. Though the local authorities investigated, there was no evidence that the Fishers were involved. And because the Fishers were well known in the town and in the community and they were popular, the investigation was dropped. There was just no evidence and no reason to believe that this beautiful woman and her businessman husband had anything to do with these disappearing men. But of course, like anything in life, after the investigation, there were rumors. And rumor being what it is and people being what they are, it soon became a working theory that Lavinia utilized her beauty to help her husband rob and kill male travelers. And as more and more men went missing, the rumor mill began to do its work. Eventually, though, the citizens of Charleston decided they'd had enough. They were not going to let these bandits cause more problems. So on February 16, 1819, taking matters into their own hands, a well-armed, organized mob operating under Lynch's law was sent out to solve the problem the highwaymen were causing. Their destination was the 5 Mile house, not to be confused with the Fisher's 6 Mile house. So, each inn is named in a part, at least, by how far outside the town it was. Now, it is not known exactly what this group of vigilantes was said to have done necessarily, but apparently after arriving at the 5 Mile house, they were satisfied and returned to Charleston, leaving one man named David Ross to stand watch in the area. Earlier the next day, though, David Ross was attacked by 2 men and dragged before a group of men and Lavinia Fisher. He looked to Lavinia for help, but instead she choked him and smashed his head through a window. Somehow, David Ross was able to escape and alert authorities. About this same time, John Peoples, and I'm just going to call him Mr. Peoples because he's the second John in our story, was traveling from Georgia to Charleston, and when he got tired from his long trip, he stopped at the 6 Mile house to see if they had room. He was apparently, or reportedly, warmly greeted by the beautiful Lavinia, who informed him they did not have a room available, but did invite him to stop for a cup of tea and a meal. He said her company was so pleasant that he ignored her husband's odd glances at him and chatted with her, answering many, many questions that she asked. She did excuse herself from the table for a moment, and when she returned with tea, she told him, "Good news! Suddenly we have a room available if you still want it." And he accepted that room while Lavinia poured him a cup of tea. Now, Mr. People didn't really like tea, but did not want to seem to be impolite. So instead of refusing it or leaving it untouched, he poured it out while she wasn't looking. Afterward, when Lavinia had shown him to his room, he began to wonder why she had asked him so many questions and why her husband stared at him all evening. So it seems like Lavinia was a pretty woman that men liked to look at, and once they were no longer in her presence, all of a sudden they realized they were being dumb and giving up too much information. I'm just saying, pretty ladies do that to men, and pretty men do that to ladies. Let's just be honest here. Anyways, Mr. Peoples then began to think that maybe the Fishers were suspicious and a little too friendly, and he decided he should go to bed early so he could get out early. However, his suspicions grew and he could not sleep, so he decided not to sleep in the bed, but to sit in the corner facing the door so he could see if anybody came in to attack him. Now, reportedly, his suspicions were confirmed when a trapdoor sprung, dropping the bed into the cellar where John Fisher was waiting with an axe. Mr. People said he escaped and hurried back to Charleston to tell the authorities. The police arrived. They arrested John and Lavinia Fisher, as well as 2 other men they had been operating with. The 6-mile Wayfarer house was thoroughly searched and the grounds dug up, and under the home there were hidden passages. The sheriff reportedly found items that could be traced to dozens of travelers and tea laced with an herb that could put somebody to sleep for hours. There was also a mechanism found that could be triggered to open the floorboards beneath the bed, and in the basement, it was reported that as many as 100 sets of remains were found. The Fishers obviously pled not guilty, but were ordered to stay in jail until their trial. In the meantime, those they were arrested and arraigned with were released on bail. So their trial was in May, and the jury did not agree with their innocent plea and found them guilty of multiple robberies and murders and sentenced them to hang. However, they were given time to appeal the conviction. During the wait, they occupied themselves by making an escape plan. You see, they were being housed together in a jail that was not heavily guarded. You've got 2 people you think killed 100 people, and you've got them in the same cell in a jail with not very many guards. Somebody did not take this very seriously. I'm just saying. Anyways, they began to make a rope from the linens in the jail. And on September 13th, they put their plan into place and used the rope to drop to the ground. However, John went first and made it out and broke the rope, leaving Lavinia trapped in the cell. Hello, let the skinny person go first. Let the lighter weight person go first. I'm just saying. Not willing to go without his wife, he returned to the jail, and the 2 were then kept under much tighter security. You think? In February of 1820, the Constitutional Court rejected their appeal, and their execution was scheduled for later that month. A local minister named Reverend Richard Furman was sent in to counsel the pair if they so wished. John reportedly freely talked to the preacher and is said to have begged the priest to save his life, well, his soul, if not his life. However, Lavinia wanted nothing to do with the priest or confession. On the morning of February 18, 1820, the Fishers were taken from the Charleston jail to be hanged on the gallows behind the building. John Fisher went quietly praying with the minister whom he had asked to read a letter. Before a crowd of some 2,000 people, the letter insisted he was innocent and asked mercy for those who had done him wrong in the judicial process. He then began to verbally plead his case before the crowd and then asked for forgiveness before he was hanged. Lavinia did not go quite so quietly. She requested to wear her wedding dress and then refused to walk to the gallows. She had to be picked up and carried, and as she was carried, she ranted and raved. Before the crowd, she continued to scream pointedly at the Charleston socialites, who she blamed for encouraging a conviction. Before her executioners could tighten the noose around her neck, she yelled into the crowd, "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, I'll carry it." Then, before they could finish the job, she jumped off the scaffold herself. And because she did not quite reach the ground, she dangled into the crowd and hung. Later, onlookers reportedly said they had never seen such a wicked stare or a chilling sneer as that which was seen on the face of 27-year-old Lavinia. And it would seem that we've reached the quiet end of our story. But I'm not even done coloring yet, so you know that cannot be the end. And like with all old tales of infamy, there's a little more to the story. In fact, the truth is somewhat less exciting. You see, Lavinia and John were not actually convicted of being a murderer. Lavinia Fisher was hanged in 1820, but the crime was highway robbery. Highway robbery was a capital offense at the time. She was not convicted of murder. It turns out Lavinia and John were members of a large gang of highwaymen who operated out of 2 houses in the backcountry outside Charleston, the 5 Mile House and the 6 Mile House. It is not actually clear whether or not the 6 Mile House was a hotel, but it did seem to serve as a hideout for a number of outlaws. You see, there is always that line between truth and fiction. And as I've already mentioned, wagon trade in and out of Charleston was a profitable business, and it was hugely important to the economy of the city. By 1819, the trade was being so disrupted by highwaymen stopping the wagons and stealing the goods and the money that it was becoming a real concern. And victims were most often completely unable to identify their assailants. So the authorities couldn't arrest anybody anyway. The lynch mob before, the group of Charleston citizens that decided to take matters into their own hands, did in fact go out looking for this band of highway robbers. It was reported in the Charleston News and Courier, quote, "A gang of desperados have for some time past occupied certain houses in the vicinity of Ashley Ferry, practicing every deception upon the unwary and frequently committing robberies upon defenseless travelers. As they could not be identified and thereby brought to punishment, it was determined by a number of citizens to break them up, and they accordingly proceeded in a convocade, I don't think I said that right, on Thursday afternoon to this spot, having previously obtained permission of the owners of some small houses, to which these desperados resorted to proceed against the premise in such manner as circumstances might require." So apparently, this mob of concerned citizens, air quotes with my fingers here, took it upon themselves to go to the area around 5 Mile House to break apart this highwayman gang. When they got to 5 Mile House, they gave the occupants 15 minutes to vacate the premises, and then they burned 5 Mile House to the ground. Then they moved on to 6 Mile House and evicted the occupants there, but that is where they left David Ross behind to guard it. And then, believing they had done their job, they went back to Charleston. It was the next morning where we talked about already how Ross was assaulted and he was taken out to Lavinia. Ross thought Lavinia would help her, but she just choked him and put his head through a window. And it was a few hours later that Mr. Peoples stopped by the 6 Mile House to water his horse. And the truth is, apparently, that he was accosted by the gang, including Lavinia, and they stole $40 cash from him. So Mr. Peoples returns to Charleston. He was able to tell the authorities the identity of some of his attackers. He did not know all of their names, but, quote, had just cause to believe that among them was William Hayward, John Fisher, and his wife Lavinia Fisher, Joseph Roberts, and John Andrews. So David Ross and Mr. Peoples' story in this version is entirely different than the story that has become known. Okay, so along with David Ross's story and Mr. Peoples' story, the authorities had to then act again, right? They had to do something. So the sheriff's deputy was a man named Colonel Nathaniel Green Cleary. He obtained a bench warrant from the judge and set out for 6 Mile House, where John and Lavinia and several members of the gang gave up without a fight and were taken to jail in Charleston. Sorry. Over the next several days, a lot of other gang members were arrested, and John Peoples was able to identify them as the group had robbed him of his $40. John and Lavinia Fisher were charged with highway robbery, which was a hanging offense at the time. This is the same time that out west, stealing horses and cattle got you shot or hung. Theft was huge. Okay, it was huge. Capital crime. While they awaited trial, a grave containing the remains of 2 bodies were found about 200 yards from 6 Mile House, and it was believed to be the bodies of a white man and a black woman that had been dead for at least 2 years. And with so many people in and out of 6 Mile House during that time, it was impossible to identify the bodies or identify the killers, so nobody was ever charged with their murder. Only 2 bodies, not 100, were found at 6 Mile House. So the legend of Lavinia Fisher had probably started already because of beauty, right? She's beautiful, but also because of rumor. But for sure, her notoriety as a female serial killer was spurred on when she screamed at the crowd, "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, I'll carry it." Right? So the Fishers were reportedly first buried in a church plot, but it is they were actually buried in Potter's Field. And it is likely that Lavinia never murdered anybody. Now, there's lots of things Lavinia did. She obviously stole things from people because she was part of a highway band group, whatever you want to call it. But it's interesting that she became, or has become known as, the first female serial killer, even though she was never convicted of murder. There are a lot of versions of Lavinia's story. There's YouTube channels, there's blog posts, there's podcasts. And I think, personally, I think her story is kept alive because she supposedly haunts that cemetery she was originally thought to be buried in, the church cemetery plot. So, I don't know. You tell me. Do you think that sometimes these old stories get kept in rotation because they're salacious as opposed to being true? It sure seems like it in Lavinia's case. It seems like the idea of having a female murderer was so exciting that somewhere along the lines of history, that is just where the story took off. I suppose, too, though, that if Lavinia holds the title of female serial killer or first female serial killer, then it helps with her ghost stories. Supposedly, Lavinia has been haunting the cemetery near the Unitarian Church where people originally thought she was buried since her death. Now, I'm not a ghost story chaser. My weird and creepy ends with the true crime. I don't need to go into the unalive portion of the world. I'm going to stick with the crime portion of the world. I did go ahead and add 2 sentiments to this card, one on the inside, one on the front. I was able to create this scene using the My Favorite Things cloud stencil. Not that you can see the clouds in the background too much on video. I also used the grassy hillside stencil from Honeybee Stamps to create a place for her to sit and eat her watermelon. After I have stamped the inside and shown you a photograph of the card, I have another picture for you. But I'm going to warn you, it may or may not be Lavinia. So there is a photograph of a portrait that was painted that is supposedly Lavinia, but nobody knows when she would have sat for that painting. So, she's pretty. If it's Lavinia, she is a pretty, pretty gal. I'm just saying. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I have a couple of other videos here I think you might like as well. I also have added a subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me what you think about this story, and I hope you have a really fabulous day.